Hopefully you folks can see my screen now. Will look good? Perfect. Great. Well, for those of you folks here, thanks so much for joining us. Today we're going to look back at basically some recent improvements that we've made to Gearset over pretty much about the last quarter or so. Now, I'm sure lots of you have already spoken to either Valerio or me before, but just in case, we'll start with a couple of intros. So I'm Matt, and I'm one of Gearset's co-founders and chief product officer. My background's in software engineering, and I did lots of the early product research for Gearset and built lots of the early tech. And then before Gearset, I worked on DevOps solutions for the Microsoft SQL Server stack. And I like to think that I've been a proponent of good engineering and release practices for the best part of 15 years or so now. These days, we have much better engineers than I am. So I look after product as a whole at Gearset and try to make sure that we're broadly solving the problems that are most pressing for you folks. And Valerio?
Yeah, hello, my name is Valerio, and I am part of the customer success team here at Gearset. I joined about 3 years ago, and I've been since talking to customers, trialists, gathering all your feedback. So a lot of the things we're going to show today has come out of conversations from people like you who are using the product and giving us lots of good ideas, criticizing us constructively, and leading us to build a better product. So you'll normally find me behind the in-app chat throughout our website. Yes. That's
Thanks, Valerio. Great. So the goal for today then is to showcase some of the most exciting new features that we've shipped in the last quarter or so. Now, because we're going to be trying to look mostly at features that are already publicly available, we're going to do our best to avoid talking about pilot features and instead focus on functionality that you folks can use today that you might have missed. If you're interested in hearing more about upcoming features, then do just let us know in the chat. We're always keen to share more about what we're building and to hear your feedback, so we can always schedule more sessions for that stuff too. So this is what we're going to talk about today. I'll start with a quick overview of the priorities that we'd set ourselves for Q2 to give you context for some of the features that we're going to talk about really. And then once I've done that, Valerio will do that trickier bit of actually demoing some of those new features. So what was our product focus for Q2 and how do we decide it? Well, to set our priorities for the year and for each quarter, we take a variety of different inputs. So user voice feedback, inbound support tickets, deliberate user research, basically any feedback we can get our hands on. And then we use all of that as well as our vision for where we want to take the products to put together a roadmap of user problems that we plan to tackle for the quarter and the year. And I really want to emphasize here, I know Valerio said it already, but the feedback that we receive from you folks, it really does help steer the direction of the product as a whole. If there's something that you don't like, something that doesn't work, or something missing, then do just let us know. And obviously, while we can't solve every user problem immediately, if other teams are struggling with the same thing, then there's a really good chance it'll make its way into our roadmap quite quickly. So we have lots of input from our users, and we're gathering more feedback every day. So in order to help us focus, we put together a yearly theme and then a quarterly theme. And this just helps us make decisions about what we should be spending most of our time on. So with those inputs and our themes, we can then build an internal roadmap that tracks which user problems we want to solve. And this user roadmap remains fairly dynamic. So we reshuffle it based on feedback on an ongoing basis. And hopefully lots of you folks have already experienced that firsthand by reaching out to Valerio and the rest of the CS team and seeing some improvements released as a result. And obviously, for those of you who've been using us for a while, you know that we tend to ship to production 2 to 3 times a day on average, which means that hopefully we can keep moving quite quickly and keep these improvements coming regularly. So we then take that internal roadmap and we create a simpler, more concrete public roadmap of things that we want to commit to for the quarter. And then we track publicly what's started, what's finished, and whether anything's been pushed back or brought forwards. So that's how we put all this together. Our focus for the year then is to make sure that you can get all of your changes all the way from dev through to production, whether you're still going from org to org or you're using Git and a source-driven flow without having to leave Gearset's UI. And that goes for any type of change that you want to make to your org, whether that's metadata or data. The features that we've been shipping in Q2 were really focused around making CI in Gearset as useful as it can possibly be, and particularly to make sure that it can handle a broader array of different types of workflow than maybe we've been able to handle before. But obviously, this isn't all we've been doing. We're still making constant improvements to the rest of the product too. So even in this world of public-facing roadmaps that we commit to, we're still listening to that feedback and shipping new improvements all the time. And it really does help us reshuffle our roadmap and focus on things that are most important for you folks. We've also got a large dedicated team working on our backup product as well, but we're deliberately avoiding talking about backup improvements today so that we can cover those either in the next one of these that we run or in a separate scheduled event that's specifically about backup. So it's not because we're not doing fun things there too. So this was intended to be just a big scary list of some of the more notable changes that we've shipped in the last quarter. So don't worry, you're not expected to be able to read it. But the point is we're consistently releasing these improvements and new features all the time. Now, obviously we can't talk about all of these today. So we've just picked out a handful of our favorite ones that we think are most interesting. And with that, much blurb from me, it's time for our actual demos. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that Valerio can take over sharing duties.
Sure. All
and
right.
then
So this one. All right. So everybody should be able to see the metadata comparison screen.
That looks good.
Somebody will tell me if it's not.
No,
cool.
We can see that, Valerio, don't worry. So before I let Valerio launch into demoing, the first area that we're going to touch on here are improvements to the existing CI functionality in Gearset. So our philosophy with CI has always been to really enforce this version control as source of truth. And that means until recently, CI in Gearset was pretty dogmatic. So we take the contents of your Git branch, we compare it against the target org, and we deploy all of the differences that we detected with some options to tweak that just a little bit. There are lots of benefits to this approach. And for teams that are in a position to work this way, it means that your Git branch is this true source of truth. There's no chance for your org and your Git branch to diverge or drift from each other. Any divergence in the target org would immediately be overwritten by the next run of the CI job. But DevOps maturity is obviously a spectrum, and not every team is set up to work in this way by any stretch. There are lots and lots of teams that, for a variety of reasons and scenarios, had workflows that necessarily differ from that ideal path. So for those teams, CI was really difficult to get up and running. So one of the changes that we've made a host of changes really to CI and Gearset to accommodate this broader variety of workflows. And I think, Valerio, you're going to demo just a few of those now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So Matt has set up basically the scenario. Back in 2020, when CI was the way it was, Gearset made some heavy assumptions about how you should use CI. So for example, one of the assumptions is that your source and target need to be fairly similar and in sync, and your development environment isn't that different from your production. The second big assumption we made was that your orgs had to be basically small enough so that we, when we do these CI job runs, that the time it takes to run isn't too long. However, from feedback from customers, one of the most extreme feedbacks was that sometimes the CI job run took more than a day to run. And that really goes against this kind of frequent release, frequent testing and iterative approach that we had. And here I'm going to just hop into, the CI job section of the app. And what you'll see is if you set up a CI job, you basically select a source and target, and these are the source and targets that we assume to be very similar. Now, that is a problem because that's well and good if you're there, and that's a very high maturity of using source control. But what if you're in the process of implementing CI and trying to convince other members of your team to use source control? In those scenarios, there'll be two things that happen. One, not everybody's on board. So let's take a look at this normal CI job I've set up between my master branch and, let's say, my integration environment. This CI job will look at lots of metadata and try to keep all those metadata in sync. A lot of the time, that metadata isn't what you're interested in. So for example, here I have a small selection. And in fact, if I just hop over to the view errors, I can see that this CI job currently is failing because of somebody else's metadata that I'm not in charge of. I don't really care. For this particular demo, I'm changing this particular custom field, and I just want to get that particular piece of metadata into my master branch out to my testing org to test. And you can imagine a scenario where there's a big team and the whole team isn't on board. So your teammates haven't resolved these conflicts or haven't kept the source and target, in this case, in sync. And therefore, we decided to build the Delta CI feature. So how do you access the Delta CI feature? If you go into creating a CI job and you go into the Advanced Settings tab, there's a button here and including a documentation. So if you want to try this out after our webinar, go and check out our documentation here that talks about everything I'm going to go through today. Enabling the Delta CI job will continue to respect your source and target selection, your metadata filter selection, but crucially, that CI job will only take into account the commit that you make. So I'm going to demo this for you. I've got two CI jobs set up, one a normal CI job here and a Delta CI job here. You can see that they have the same source and same target, and you'll have to trust me that it's got the same metadata filter. I'm now going to go into my master branch and make a change to my field. Okay, so here's my GitHub master branch. This is the object, the Gearset employee object that I'm going to change. And at present, I've got 4 different pick list values, A, B, C, and D. All right, I'm going to just add in and make a commit to my master branch and add in an additional value and see the way the CI job kicks off. Cool, let me just add in the value E here. Okay, and upon committing, that should trigger my CI job. So if I go back here into my CI job dashboard, if I refresh, you can see both of the jobs are running, and we'll see crucially how they differ. So in a normal CI job, just as I showed you before, the history, the errors will remain the same because we still have conflicts that haven't been resolved, metadata of other metadata of feature changes that I'm currently not changing, and that will continue to fail and be a problem in me setting up this workflow. However, if I now go back to my CI job for the Delta CI job, I can see that's completed. And if I look at the history, it's very interesting that first, there's no error, and 2, if I look into the comparison history of what the CI job ran, it only picks up the single item of metadata that I've committed in that particular commit or in that particular pull request. In that way, I can push the change that I made, the change of the change of the pick list value, the addition of the pick list value E to the target. And now that particular feature is ready in the target org, sort of bypassing all the conflict errors that are happening in a normal CI job. So this not only helps you start to get used to committing stuff and using source control, this is another advantage for teams with really, really large orgs. So if your org has metadata that takes hours and hours to download and compare, a traditional, well, an old CI job would basically take too long for the CI job to be useful. And as you can see, because we're only downloading a specific narrow set of metadata that is in your commit, that CI job will run far quicker and allow you to implement this iterative process much better. And this is basically to help people who are adopting the different stages of what we call maturity. So it's okay if you don't have your orgs in sync. It's okay if only you and the team want to implement source control driven workflow. We also now help you to do that. Yeah, so that's the first thing I wanted to show you. Is it okay if I move on from now to the next stage? I want to show you how another way we help with CI jobs now.
Yeah, I think let's move on, and then we can capture all the questions at the end and make sure that we manage to get through everything.
Cool. So the second part is to do with problem analyzers. So for people who are unfamiliar with problem analyzers, this is one of Gearset's great selling points, where not only do we look at your metadata, we understand the dependencies. So in this example here, I've got 2 custom fields, this discount percentage, and that has a formula that relates to discount rate. So if I deploy discount percentage without discount rate, Gearset is clever enough to notice that and tell you that that is a potential problem and then suggest a fix. In a manual comparison and deploy scenario like this, you have the option to manually accept Gearset suggestions, or if you're sure, you can also ignore it. This is great and gives you that flexibility. However, back in 2020, this was going to be a problem in a CI scenario. In a CI scenario, because everything is automated, we have to make a decision to select all the suggestions that Gearset gives you, and users didn't have a way of bypassing that. So you can see these CI job runs will tell you which problem analyzers were run and which fixes were applied, but there wasn't really a way for you to override it or untick it and avoid particularly something that you really wanted to do, but Gearset is recommending you not to do. This can happen in the scenario where you're committing only a subset of your metadata into your repo. You're not ready to commit everything. You're in the process of adding more and more metadata types to your repository. And that could lead to dependencies that are missing, that Gearset identifies as missing, and therefore remove potentially things that would fail further down the line. To address this, in 2021, we have released the ability to create problem analysis templates. So in the account settings here, we have the additional ability to create problem analysis templates. And if you go and create a new template, you can choose to enable or disable specific problem analyzers. And that template will get applied when you run the CI job. So if I now swap over to the CI job settings, again, back in that advanced tab here, you can select which problem analyzer template to apply. And in this way, you can override the default suggestions that Gearset provides, again, enabling you to adopt CI without having everything ready in your repository. So the third thing that I want to mention about CI jobs that we've made a difference to is, again, if you have static code analysis running, in the past, Gearset will fail the CI job only when there's errors. However, perhaps you're in the process of becoming stricter on your static code analysis and also want the CI job to fail when warnings appear. This is, again, something that customers has feedback to us, and we've added the ability for you to choose what sort of granularity and how strict you want to be when you run CI jobs. Cool. That sort of summarizes the three things. I'll hand over back to Matt for a bit.
Thanks so much, Valerio. So those are some improvements to kind of the existing functionality around CI and Gearset. Now, at the start, I spoke about our goal of letting you deploy changes from dev all the way through to production, regardless of your workflow or without having to leave Gearset. So far, we've spoken about some improvements to CI that make it easier to deploy metadata, but metadata is obviously only part of the problem. Configuration isn't always represented as metadata. There are lots of managed packages, for instance, that use data to store their configuration. If you're using these managed packages, you likely want to deploy changes to them in exactly the same way that you do with metadata. And those changes should flow through your release pipeline out to production in the same way too. Now, Gearset's already got the ability to deploy data, as hopefully lots of you have seen. And although you can use that data deployment functionality to deploy config data, it can be kind of tricky. We originally designed it for sandbox seeding and deploying subsets of transactional data. And our data loader currently doesn't tie into CI jobs either. So we've started adding support for comparing and deploying data config changes in the same way that you can compare and deploy metadata. And this is going to be supported in CI by default. We've started out by supporting velocity, which Valerio is going to demo in a second, but we're always working on extending this approach to other types of configuration data too. And that work is underway now. And we're starting off by focusing on other popular managed packages. Now, I've got to admit here that I said I wasn't going to talk about things that were in pilot, but this one kind of is, but we're so close to GA that we wanted to include it anyway. So over to you again, Valerio.
Sure. So, for example, most of you might be very familiar with the metadata types, custom objects, flows, and profiles. And those are traditional metadata types that Gearset already supports. Additionally, the velocity type can be seen like this. So these are flex cards, and I've created an additional flex card within the velocity package. And for example, this team weather forecast is considered configuration information, but not supported by the metadata API. So the way that Gearset is supporting this is through the familiar compare and deploy screen. I've selected a source and target, but crucially, the difference, instead of going to the metadata types to include that you're familiar with, you might have seen this toggle where you can choose velocity types to include. For this particular demo, I'm going to choose some metadata types and run that comparison just like you are familiar with. During this process, in a similar way to the way we retrieve metadata, we're using a different API to download the information from this velocity package, no longer called metadata because it's strictly data, but it's configuration information of your Salesforce org. And we present this information in the same way as metadata that you're familiar with already. So you can see the new flex card that I created here, team forecast, is available, and you will see that the dependencies, the components are all in the familiar, presented in the familiar way. You can choose a particular bit of configuration item to deploy to your target org, but also crucially, because of the way that Gearset has set up, the target can also be a source control repository, meaning you can start to source control these configuration items in a way that you couldn't before. In the past, you deployed it to a target, you make a new deployment to the target org, that gets overwritten, but now this is automatically included in CI jobs. So that metadata filter with the toggle is also available in CI jobs, meaning, yep, all this configuration information can be inside your repository.
Cool. Thanks, Valerio. And obviously, yeah, you can push that straight through to the target org, straight into your Git repo. Gearset CI will pick it up just as normal. And any subsequent CI features that are coming out soon, like the pipeline stuff that we demoed at the summit, it's also included in that too. Now, as I've said, velocity is just the beginning. So if there are managed packages that you folks work with where you'd love to be able to source control that config data just like metadata and then release it via your CI process, then please do let us know, because that'll really help us prioritize which packages we focus on supporting first. So next up then, Valerio, you're going to talk about Gearset's repo cleaner, I believe, which is a feature that tries to make sure that your Git repo is kept in a deployable state at all times, regardless of whether you're trying to deploy changes from it with Gearset or some other tool like the DXCLI, by automatically removing references to deleted metadata. Over to you.
Sure. So in the example screen here, we can see a Gearset comparison. Crucially, this works only when the target is a repo. So my source is a Salesforce org, my target is a repo. Now, just take a look at here, we have the deletion of a custom object, which is fair and easy, and that's fine. But the problem is deleting this custom object without taking into account any of the dependencies creates problems. For example, I here have a profile that references that custom object, and that custom object permission will no longer be useful inside your repository. So your repository will have perhaps translations to an object, perhaps profile permissions to an object, but you've deleted the object and those bits of metadata are no longer really useful. And that creates a problem when you then deploy that repository onto the next org, because the next org will receive a package that contains a custom object permission for a custom object that no longer exists. The way Gearset helps with this is if you select and deploy just the custom object, the deployment will successfully delete your custom object. And in the past, we didn't surface this well enough for you to be aware of what's going on in the backend. Here we've added a repository cleaner report. And you'll see here that because we deleted that object, we also go in and delete the permissions from your profiles. This extends to lots of junction objects like layout permissions, like field translations, all in the name of creating a repository at the end of your deployment that is ready to be deployed onto the next environment. And this comes across because we decided to implement this because a lot of customers will go ahead and run a deployment to their Git target of the deletion of one object, and they would be really confused and say, I deleted one metadata item. Why is it in my repo that I have maybe 10, maybe 50 changes that I wasn't expecting? I used to have to explain these are the repo cleaners that are helping you maintain that. But now we have this report here to help you understand what Gearset is doing. And also, if that's no longer something you want to do, we've also made it configurable. So if you click on the configuration, you can disable that default and not use the repository dependency cleaner if you didn't want to.
Cool. Thanks, Valerio. And this comes in particularly handy in a couple of scenarios. For example, when folks are getting up and running with Gearset for the first time, they may have a repository that isn't quite as tidy as it could conceivably be, where there are some vestigial dependencies floating around. And it's also particularly useful when you're working with teammates who aren't necessarily using Gearset to deploy their changes, but maybe they're using Git and the DX CLI, and sometimes occasionally things can get missed. So it's a really powerful feature, and it's great to now have it surfaced, the changes that it's making on your behalf. So next up, so lots of teams we work with are pretty much entirely focused on Salesforce. And for those teams, it's really good to have a Salesforce-specific DevOps platform like Gearset. But there are other teams that manage Salesforce releases that are also responsible for other technical infrastructure inside their organizations. So perhaps they're the DevOps team for the software product the company sells to, and they already have a whole bunch of DevOps infrastructure, like Azure DevOps, for instance, to manage the release of that. These teams still want the benefit of Gearset's unrivaled ability to successfully deploy metadata. And as I'm sure you've heard about before, because I talk about it all the time, we put a lot of engineering effort into making sure that deployments with Gearset are significantly more likely to work than if you're deploying metadata changes any other way. And as a result, around 93% of all deployments done in Gearset over the last 60 days were successful. So to accommodate those teams who want to use all of their existing DevOps infrastructure in conjunction with Gearset, we've now added an external public API that Valerio is going to demo for us. This is like the nerdiest demo that we're going to show today, I think.
Yeah, so don't worry if you don't follow what I say today. Let me just point out to you where the documentation of this is. So if you go ahead into your account, we do have pilot features available, and the documentation about the public API is here. So everything I talk about, I'm basically going through this documentation here for you. So Larry, the first step.
You've just made me realize that we're talking about another pilot feature, even though I said I wouldn't talk too much about pilot features. This one is also very close to GA, which is my excuse.
Cool. Yeah, so the first thing you want to be able to do is to so if you're going to be calling Gearset and executing things, the first thing we want to be able to do is authenticate you. Actually, let me take a step back and just set the scene of what I'm going to do. Currently, if you want to kick off a CI job, what you need to do is go into the Gearset app, either click on the Run Now button, or like I showed you before, trigger a CI job by making a commit on your source Git branch. What I'm going to do in this demo is to trigger the CI job completely outside of Gearset. And the way that this is triggered can be integrated into scripts that you have. And you should see the value of that, of not needing to jump into the Gearset user interface if you don't want to. Specifically today, I'm going to demo with this public API demo, and I'm going to trigger this without clicking the Run Now button. So in order to do this, what I really need to do is let Gearset know who I am. So if I go into the access token management, I can create an access token. And this access token that I will show will let Gearset know who it is that's making this request. I'm just going to copy that access token here. Don't worry about all of these commands. They are in the documentation. I'm just going to use that to make the demonstration work. Now that I have this access token, if I now go back to the CI job and grab the CI job ID, so this is the CI job, copy the CI job ID. Okay, and that's all I need to trigger some stuff. So all I need to do is open my terminal. And in this terminal, I'm going to send, I think they called it a HTTP curl command using this access token. So this access token will say, hey, this is Valerio. I would like to inquire and ask about the status of this CI job with the CI job ID that I just copied. So this is the first step in that. If I run that query, Gearset will, the endpoint from Gearset will tell you that the moment this job is idle, not running, and you're okay to carry out the next step. So the next step that I'm going to do is simulate the kicking off of a CI job. Again, using the access token there. I'm going to kick off the CI job by running this command. And imagine this being a script that you prepare somewhere else, just calling Gearset, and it will tell you the run ID that it's currently kicked off. I'm just going to copy that. And if I refresh this page, I should be able to see that that CI job running. And you can now just let it run. On top of that, because I have this run ID, I can also execute a command to see how that run is doing and potentially check if it's completed. Has it not completed? In this case, it hasn't completed. 1 second, I forgot to use the access token. Let me just pop that access token there and send off that command again, hopefully to show you that this one started, and given enough time, it should tell me that it's completed, and then I can then continue the next task in my script. Let me just see if that's completed so I can show you. Okay, in this case, it's completed, but my CI job has failed. That's fine. Now I can then go in and take the next step. Now, before I finish this part of the demo, it's really important that this access token is the way that Gearset knows who you are. Because I've shown it to all of you during this webinar, I'm probably going to be security conscious and going to go and delete that access token so nobody can impersonate me and kick off my CI jobs.
Great stuff. Thanks, Valerio. And thank you for being security conscious at the end there. And obviously, during Valerio's day job, he would never, ever paste something like an access token into a text file like that, just for the purposes of the demo, just to be very clear. Good stuff. Now, the surface area of the API is currently limited to the stuff that Valerio's shown, so running and tracking the results of automation jobs. But if you'd like to see us expose more via the API, then please get in touch and let us know those use cases that you folks have. Now, lastly, to wrap up, we just wanted to show that it's not all about CI-related features. We're still making improvements to the rest of the product too. So Valerio's going to show how we've started to address non-determinism in the ordering in the metadata that Salesforce returns to us, which can make comparison results more noisy than we'd like. So Valerio, over to you again.
So again, this is one of the major gripes since I've started at Gearset. People will continually tell me, hey, I've got a difference in my comparison, but really the difference I can see here is just a reordering of the metadata. As you can see here, the value yes and no are swapped around. And this is particularly bad in layout items. So those of you that deal with layout metadata will know that if I take layout metadata from an org, I commit it to a source repository that doesn't change. The next day, if I run that comparison, there's no guarantee, and it's very likely a lot of the time that the order will be different. We want to make it easier to help you identify differences that you care about versus the XML ordering differences that you probably don't mind so much. And in 2021 and earlier this year, we've launched this button that allows you to hide the reordering. So in that case, we basically reorder the XML and show you that there's no differences here, and that carries over to this one as well. So if there were other differences between, let's say, my custom field that I really cared about, by ticking this, I would be surfacing those and basically hiding and suppressing the differences that are just due to XML element reordering.
Great.
I think that's everything I have to show you.
Thank you, Valerio. Now, as always, we're incrementally improving this stuff all the time. So what we've just shown here around XML reordering is just the first slice of the feature. It proves out the tech behind it, but we've got plans to make this more automatic in places where we know that Salesforce can be non-deterministic and the ordering has no semantic meaning. So hopefully you'll find that super useful. I do have a final thank you slide to throw up, but it doesn't seem worth switching over the screen share. But this is all we wanted to show you this time around. So we've touched on a handful of improvements to CI that enable a wider variety of teams, I should say, to start taking advantage of it. We've spoken about our plans to make config data a first-class citizen in Gearset and allowing teams to source control and continuously integrate config data changes, just like metadata, starting with velocity first. We covered how to keep your Git repos in a deployable state using the repo cleaner and how that's now surfaced in the UI. We showed how the public API can help teams integrate Gearset with more general purpose DevOps infrastructure. And obviously, we've just shown some cool XML reordering stuff to hide immaterial changes. So I hope that was interesting for you folks and that we managed to show you some stuff that you hadn't seen before. At this point, I think we're good to start looking at some questions that have come in. So let me take a quick look.
We
So
have quite a few. Would it be helpful for me to read them out, or have you found them?
I've found them, so I think it's good. We can start diving into them. So I'll just work from the top. So Lex asking about Delta CI. Is it true that it respects only your commits, but in addition to the commit since the last successful deployment? So the example is if you have a hotfix and then release a CI job, so you have a hotfix and release CI job going into production. Since release goes more often than hotfix or vice versa, the hotfix will push more than just your commit and try to catch up that CI job to the most recent commit in that branch. Oh, that's a good question. If I've understood it correctly, then the Delta CI only pays attention to itself, essentially. So each job independently considers its own delta. So if you have two deltas monitoring, if you have two delta CI jobs deploying to the same org, the first delta CI job will take all changes since it last successfully ran, and the second delta CI job will take all changes since it successfully ran. They won't consider each other, which means that, yeah, you could end up in a case where they're both trying to deploy some similar items if they're getting deployed from the same source branches. Does that answer your question? I think I've understood that properly. Hopefully that answers your question. Feel free to shout if that didn't make any sense, and I'll try and add some more clarification. But until then, I'll move on to the next question. So the difference between CI jobs and the Delta job different. Okay, so the standard CI job in Gearset of old will take everything that's in the source repository in the branch that's the source for your CI job. It'll then run a full comparison of the source against the metadata from your target according to the metadata filter on that job, and then it'll deploy any differences that Gearset detects. With Delta CI, what it'll do, instead of taking everything in the source, retrieving everything in the target and running a full comparison, it'll look at the source and find the differences, the things that have changed since the last successful run of that job. So if you've done lots and lots and lots of, if there are lots and lots of changes inside your repo, but you've only made changes, you've only made a small subset of changes in your recent PR, then rather than look at all of the changes in the repo, the Delta CI job will just look at the changes in the PR, fetch that from the target, build the comparison deployment based off that smaller subset, and then deploy those changes. So it generally means you're deploying fewer things. And if you've got necessary differences between source and target, those necessary differences will remain and be preserved, and the CI job won't overwrite them. From Ram, how are we taking the Delta CI changes based on the committed developer? We're not. That's not actually how it works. So rather than it being on a per developer basis, it just takes changes made since the last successful run of the CI job. And Scott, is it a configuration on the job? Yes, each CI job has its own checkbox in the advanced tab here, where you can choose to enable Delta CI for it. Another question from Lex. A common issue we have is some developers sort their pick lists and others don't. I know in the compare and deploy screen you can ignore reordering, as we've just shown, but knowing that most devs use local text editors, is that something that's coming to the CI job as an option too? Yeah, so that was basically what I alluded to at the end. The plan is to identify the cases where that reordering is basically immaterial, where nobody cares about that particular order, because it doesn't really affect Salesforce itself, and automatically ignore those reorderings in standard compares and in CI jobs as well. Regarding static code analysis, have you guys in pipeline a Delta-like behavior where the SCA errors are triggered only for the change in the commit and not for the whole code base? Oh, that's a really interesting question. For a project like ours, we're trying to put hold on these problems. Would be quite a pain to enable such an option right away to fix the errors and warnings. That's a good question. Firstly, what we found most folks do when they start using SCA for the first time is pick a subset of rules, pick one or two rules and start squashing those, and then gradually add more rules. That said, I think if you enable Delta CI, the Gearset's only going to run, for those CI jobs at least, Gearset's only going to run static code analysis on the things that are retrieved from the source and target, which will be the things in the Delta, I believe. So that actually might get you closer to where you want to be. I hadn't thought about that. but that might help you out there. At the moment, there's no other way to say only include Delta SCA, except for perhaps in that context of a Delta CI job.
I have another idea, actually.
Oh,
so in the same way with the problem analyzer templates, with the static code analysis, you can set what static code analysis rule sets you choose. So on the screens here, I've got the default rule set, but if you go ahead and create a rule set and just disable everything and enable them one by one as you get familiar with them, you can apply these static code analysis rule sets to your CI job. So when you create a CI job, you can choose basically which rule set you use. And if you create one that is basically very basic, that only enables 2 rule sets, that will help you get there by enabling more and more as you go. I think that would be another way to address this.
Cool. Thanks, Valerio. And then another question, does Gearset plan to be able to show failure reasons for developers without pro license assignments? That's a good question, and one that I hadn't thought of. I don't have a concrete answer for you today. I think the short answer is we've got no immediate plans for that, but it's not something I've thought about much. But I will take a note of that after the call and make sure that it's something that we at least think about. Okay, and we've got some stuff going on in the chat as well. So I'm going to dive into that. Oh, and thanks, Lex, for shouting out Grid Buddy there. That's definitely something that I'm assuming that's in response to the managed packages that you might want to flow through your CI job. So I'll jot a note down of that too. And then, right, let's take a look at the chat and see if I can catch up. So is there any roadmap for upcoming features, support for Einstein wave recipes and template bundle metadata types in particular? We do have a public roadmap for upcoming features at gearset.com/roadmap. You'll notice, actually, embarrassingly, I was hoping no one would ask this question. You'll notice that embarrassingly, it's actually a little bit out of date at the moment, and we're due a refresh on that to put up the next couple of quarters, which should happen in the next week or so. As for the Einstein recipes and template bundle metadata, I'll just drop a note of that, and we can go away and follow up, because that should be something that that we jump on top of pretty quickly. As ever, when it comes to metadata types that you folks spot that are missing, if you prod us in the in-app chat there, then that's a good encouragement for us to quickly bump those up our priority list. We do try to stay on top of them, but occasionally things creep in that perhaps we don't notice or we don't immediately pick up. So if you do spot those, then please shout, and we'll do our best to jump straight on top of those. As for environment variables, are they going to be delivered soon? Yes, that's, I can't give a concrete time frame again, but that's something that's in active development at the moment, and we hope to have a pilot very, very soon. Again, no concrete timeframes, but the aim is to have that available in this quarter at the latest. What is our plan to implement support for pipelines for GitLab? Well, that's an interesting question. I think maybe that's one that is probably worth following up with. I guess it depends on exactly what you mean. So obviously, by exposing bits of functionality via the public API, then you can start plugging Gearset into any existing GitLab pipelines that you might have set up. And then for folks who aren't using GitLab pipelines specifically, then Gearset has its own pipeline implementation that we demoed an early version of at the summit that we hope to have coming out to GA very soon. Okay, let's see. Oh, are you going to implement environment variables? Yes. So the plan is to try, just to give some clarity on global versus per environment. The plan at the moment, and this is very forward-looking because obviously we've not shipped this and we don't have a pilot available yet. So please take this one with a pinch of salt. Obviously our plans may change, but the plan at the moment is to try and implement this at the top level in Gearset. So you can configure environment variables that will be applied on any deployment to that particular org that you've configured the environment variable that you've configured the environment variable against, whether it's manual or a CI job. As for global environment variables, that's I'm assuming that means something that applies to all all of your orgs. That's super interesting, and I would love to have a quick chat about that after the fact. So I'll just jot a note down, and I'll follow up offline after the call to get a bit of a chance to dig into that, if that's okay. Why is Delta CI not available for validations? This is it's at the moment it's a technical limitation of how Delta CI is implemented. So yeah, that one again is probably one that I think if we're going to have a conversation offline, it's probably a good one to dive into the details of that because it gets a bit nutty at times. Hopefully, at some point we'll be able to work around those technical limitations, but for now it's just a bit of a technical blocker for us. Is there the possibility that we can show data restore in backup jobs? Yeah, that's a good question. We've actually got a bunch of really exciting work going on that dramatically changes our data restore process. So hopefully when we run that separate backup session, we'll be able to demo that in that session. Will API return detailed information about a failed job, including issues related to static code analysis? At the moment, the information that it returns is a little bit limited. But if you give us a little bit more info about your use cases there and what you want to do with it, then there's a real good chance that we'll be able to expand the API to support more of that information. It's all there and available. We're just sending back what we think is kind of the minimum necessary that folks are looking for at the moment. But the more we hear about, the more we'll be able to expand that. I see. Oh, the Gearset pipeline stuff that we demoed at the summit. Yeah, we still have a concrete date for GA, but the hope is to have that available in GA this quarter. Again, don't hold me to that. It's still in active development and pilot at the moment. Okay, and let's see. Do we have a plan to support the feature of having a metadata filter that gets updated and is consistently persisted to also the CI job that might use it? Oh, I see. Yeah, the fact that you have a single metadata filter that you use as a main filter for comparisons and deployments, I guess, for pushing your changes into your Git repo, but then the CI job filters are independent and aren't refreshed when those filters change. That's a really interesting question because how should I phrase this? It's an interesting question because I think that's a change that we should make, but I need to have a slightly bigger discussion internally with some folks to figure out if that's a really sensible approach and just to canvas a little bit with more users to see if that's a thing that folks are looking for. I think the main reason that we haven't done that to begin with is that we didn't want to introduce the risk of folks changing a filter when they're running a manual comparison deployment and inadvertently changing the behavior of a CI job without realizing it. But I think there are probably better ways to handle that than not automatically updating that, maybe with a bit of messaging at the time that you modify the filter, for instance. So it's definitely something I would like to do, but I can't personally commit to it without a little bit more research first. And do we have a roadmap to integrate third-party SCA tool like Checkmarks? It's not on the roadmap at the moment, but as I've said a couple of times already on this call, I'd quite like to jump offline and have a quick chat about that, if that's okay. I'd love to know your use case, what you're getting out of Checkmarks, and just to hear a little bit more about it, if that's okay. So I will reach out after this call and follow up with you as well. And hopefully we can talk that through a little bit. Cool. I think that's all of the questions that are outstanding. Does anyone have any final questions that they want to throw away before we sign off? A couple more seconds. Okay. Well, thank you again so much for turning up and listening to this. Like I say, we're planning to do these on a regular cadence, hopefully every quarter or so, and we'll try and do some more forward-looking ones as well, so you kind of get to see both sides of it, what's about to come out and the cool stuff that we've done recently. And obviously, any questions at any point, please feel free to reach out. I'm matt@gearset.com, matt@gearset.com, and I try to respond to pretty much every email, so stay in touch. Oh, one more question. I'm going to do this last one, and then I'll say bye properly. Is it possible to deploy only profiles and permission sets without deploying the related metadata? As part, I'm assuming that's as part of a CI job, because obviously in the manual compare and deploy sense, although you have to retrieve everything with those profiles, you can deploy just the profiles themselves. As part of a CI job, That's a really good question.
In that scenario, do we just want to create a profile and none of the permissions?
I think it might be just deploying permissions changes rather than deploying permissions changes and any other items that go with it. Yeah, I'm not sure. I think off the top of my head, the scenarios where you might want to do that might end up causing other problems depending on, I guess if you've added other related metadata or changed other related metadata that impacts the permission sets or profiles too, then that could cause deployment failures. I think the short answer is at the moment in Gearset, you can set up a CI job that only has profiles and permission sets enabled, but all you'll get is the bare bones of the profile. You won't get any of the actual permissions that I imagine you care about because they need to be included in the retrieve along with the profile. And if you set up a CI job that has profiles and permission sets and the things that you care about permissions for, then Gearset will try and deploy those things for you as well. So I think the short answer is we don't handle that scenario right now, but I'd love to hear more about your use case. So I'll just make a note and I'll drop an email your way just to see if there's any more that you can share about that after the fact. Okay. So sorry, I didn't have a better answer for that right now. Cool. All right. And with that, I think we'll wrap it up. So thanks again, everyone, so much. Whoever's left, I can't see because I've lost my Zoom window. I might just be looking to myself now. And hopefully we'll see you again next time.